Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Whitehouse Communications webinar on the do's and don'ts of business lobbying in the EU. We're excited to see so many of you today, so thank you for joining us. My name is Viviana. I'm CEO and Head of European Affairs at Whitehouse Communications, and I will be moderating this session today. We had over 200 registrations for today, a testament of the interest of the topic we're covering, but also of the caliber of our speakers. So let me introduce them to you. On our panel today, we have David Coen, who's Vice Dean International for the Faculty of Social Sciences, Professor of Public Policy at the Department of Political Science, and Founding Director of the Global Governance Institute at University College London. He was also head of department at UCL for many years, and held appointments at the London Business School and the Max Planck Institute in Cologne. He also wrote a PhD at the European University Institute in beautiful Florence. David has done various publications, including his most recent book on business lobbying, which we're going to be talking about today. Our second speaker is MEP Pilar del Castillo. Mrs. del Castillo is an MEP for Spain's Partido Popular in the European People's Party group. She has been an MEP since 2004, so nearly 2 decades, and is currently a member of the Committee on Industry, Research and Energy, and the Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence in the Digital Age. MEP Pilar has been involved in very high-profile dossiers in the European Parliament in the area of electronic communication and wider technology issues. And she's also been a Minister of Education, Culture and Sport in Spain, alongside holding academic posts in political science in her native Spain. Dr. Andy Tarrant is our Director of European Affairs and Public Policy, and he is based at Whitehouse Brussels office. He has previously been an EU competition and regulatory lawyer, ran the Brussels office of a European Trade Association, worked for Labour shadow ministers in the UK House of Commons, and wrote detailed reports for the Tony Blair Institute on the consequences of Brexit. He left the UK in 2019 to attend the École Nationale d'Administration in France. On the academic front, he specializes on issues of EU regulatory design, and he and David have written a chapter on this for a reference book on regulation. So welcome everyone, and thank you so much for being with us today. The questions that we will cover today around business lobbying are here on the slides. You can all see them. We're going to be looking at how lobbying is in Brussels is different from other jurisdictions. We are going to be looking at how business lobbying has evolved over the years. We're going to ask ourselves, how do we develop a successful lobbying campaign? This is a question that we're asked very, very often. And when and how does one best approach policymakers on this issue? Just a couple of housekeeping bits from me before we move on to more interesting things. We want to remind all speakers to please mute yourself while you're not speaking, just so we don't get background noise. And for participants, please direct your questions through the Q&A function in the chat. And if possible, please do add your name and the name of the organization that you're writing from. We will address as many questions as possible during today's panel. However, should there be no time, we'll endeavor to respond to you after the webinar. So please direct your questions to the email address on the slide. At the same time, please do report any technical issues to my colleague Denise. You will see her email in the chat function. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over the floor to Dr. David Coen, who's going to present his recently published book on business lobbying in the EU. David, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
First of all, I'll mute myself, that helps. Thank you very much for the kind invitation to present my new book, Business Lobbying in the EU. Perhaps we can just go straight to the next slide and you can see the beautiful cover. It's a book I've written with Alexander Castillo and Matteo Vanoni, my 2 co-authors. It's a major book. It's almost 30 years of studying the European Union, and particularly business lobbying in the European Union. So the first half of the book is really based on continuous interviews with functionaries, parliamentary officials, and with companies, and a survey every 10 years from 1994, 2004, 2015 of the top 100 companies, asking them how they lobby, how they allocate resources, what's their logic of political behavior. It also draws on a major study that I was kindly invited to do for the European Parliament in 2017, 16-17, which looked at the MEPs' attitudes to lobbying. Now, I won't have time in today's presentation to take you through that part, but it is in the book, the surveys and attitudes of MEPs to being lobbied. And it draws on a body of work that I've conducted over years, looking at variation in lobbying activity from both the supply and the demand side, both how companies can respond to the opportunities to lobby and how the Commission and the European Parliament demand or require inputs to make policy. And we try and explore variation across the policy cycle and variation across different policy and issue areas, as well as thinking of the whole of Brussels in terms of lobbying. And finally, the book draws upon a major study that I conducted with some other colleagues, Matea, with the British Academy, or for the British Academy, on revolving doors in Brussels, looking at who were the lobbyists and what were their career paths. And we got some nice counterintuitive results if you compare it to the traditional literature in the US on revolving doors, showing the maturity of public affairs and the professionalism of government affairs in Brussels. Okay, should we go to the next slide? So I hope in this talk really to address three core questions. One would be that macro side, basically, how have businesses' preferences for lobbying changed over the last 20 to 30 years, the changing logic of action in light of institutional changes, market changes as the single market emerged and as we got the liberalization directives and we move forward into the regulation of today, looking at changes in treaty and powers and changes in delegation of authority to the EU and how that changed business activity. I'll try and talk a little bit about how government affairs offices and the people within them have changed over time, moving from in the very early days of 80s being people that were perhaps retiring out of the top civil service positions, both in the Commission and in government, towards the professionalization of government affairs divisions with people coming through the companies. I'll try and look at the meso, the where and the why, how this changes in terms of institutional demands, which affects the density and diversity of interest mobilization, because we tend to think of the EU as one style of lobbying, but there is a lot of variation depending on the DGs or the committees that you're sitting on in terms of the voice and the type of actors that will come to it. And if there's time, we can talk a little bit about the micro structure of government affairs and what makes good lobbying, though I know my two other colleagues on this panel will talk more to that. Okay, just a little bit of context, a little bit of scale. As all of you probably know in the audience, lobbying is big business in Brussels. It's €1 billion business. There's over 12,000, almost 13,000 interest groups registered on the Transparency Register. Over half of those registered are economic groups, trade associations, federations, firms. There's some 750 plus companies registered on the Transparency Register. To put that in context, when I first started studying this in the very early 90s, there were only about 50 companies that would have said they had an active EU public policy agenda. And I probably interviewed all 50 of those back in early 90s. And if you translate that into total numbers, that's, if you say average organization's 3 or 4 people, that means there's about 30 to 40,000 lobbyists dealing with almost a comparable number of functionaries and EU officials. There's about 40,000 plus EU officials. So there's almost a 1-for-1 of interest groups to policy-making officials within the EU institutions. So to some degree, that creates a resource dependency. Now, whether that's positive or negative is something we can possibly discuss. I would argue that in many cases it's positive, that the government often and the functionaries need interest groups to provide information, and it's for the institutions to regulate and to control and determine that style of action, and to encourage certain codes of conduct and certain behaviour. So many people have argued over the years that Brussels is an elite pluralist environment. I would argue that there's variation across the policy cycle, and there's variation across the issues, and I'll present some data to show that. Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay, all right, so this graph is in the book. It's the macro couple of chapters, but this sort of really summarizes the sort of changing behavior. This was the three surveys, but there's the first survey in 94 was also asking what people did in 84. And we asked companies to allocate a hypothetical bundle of units, 100 units, to lobbying on EU policy making issues. And we asked them to allocate between European and national channels for political influence, whether that be the National Association on the left-hand side, or the European Commission, MEP, European Parliament Committee of Professional Lobbyists on the right-hand side. And what we see over time is there's been an increase in direct action as opposed to collective action, a move away from sort of the Euro-corporatism towards business pluralism. There's been an increase in activity directly at the European level to the European institutions. There's been an increase in the number of firms that are active in Brussels, as I said, from that 50 to 750, and that the type of people have changed from being EU officials sitting in the government affairs towards the professional in-house lobbyists. Now, going to some of these institutions individually, the first thing to say is that the primary and first port of call for most businesses when lobbying is the European Commission. It's seen as the primary locus of activity. It has the right of initiative, and we were often quoted the magical figure, the 60% rule. If we can get into the pre-cooking, if we can get into the early discussions on a directives formulation, 60% of what's written in that first document will probably make it all the way through the legislative process. And so there's an incentive to be involved in the policy process early and to be part of the Commission's sort of initiatives. The second thing to think about, and was said to us when we talk to companies, is that most companies perceive the European Commission as a regulatory agency or a regulatory agency model, in that expertise was the most valued. It was obviously not a political organization. It's an organization that is looking for expertise and for technical inputs to make good policy making. And that has implications in terms of the legitimacy that the institution is demanding. So traditionally, we talk in political science about output legitimacy. Good regulations that can be implemented, that can be delivered, give legitimacy to the organization that is making it. And this is called output legitimacy. So there's this perception that the Commission is looking for output legitimacy on its regulatory issues, while being aware that it needs input legitimacy to be seen to have a wide consultation and a discussion with the appropriate number of vested interests. And I'm going to show you the variation in policy areas, the variation between NGOs, civil society and business across policy in a moment. The other thing to say is, dealing with the European Commission, is it's a long run game. In Washington, many bureaucrats, many civil servants change with the administration. In Brussels, individuals, regardless of the reforms of the European Commission, have stay within their DG, stay within their policy areas. And so there's long institutional memory. So it's very important that you build up your credibility, that you build up your trust with the interlocutors, with the Commission officials, if you're going to be an effective lobbyist. They have a large amount of discretion about who's invited to consultations, or certainly in the early stages, in the pre-cooking. And if they don't trust you, you're less likely to be one of those favored individuals that's brought into the early discussion. So it's about consultation, it's about conciliation, it's about discretion politics, as opposed to, say, Washington, which is about campaign contributions and about the political contacts that you have. Now, over time, as you can see, the European MEPs and the European Parliament has risen. When I first started looking at this in the very early 90s, lobbying of the European Parliament, while it did occur, was very much seen as a sort of second order option. You can see the numbers were very low. They sort of went there to sort of monitor and watch, make sure nothing happened in the political plenaries that would undermine them. But over time, with Maastricht, with Amsterdam, with the introduction initially of co-decision, and then increasingly with trilogues, and then increasingly with the fact that so many policies go through on for about 80% of policies are going through on first readings, the importance of getting to the committees, getting to the rapporteurs and the shadow rapporteurs has increased. The reality that there is a sort of technical oversight, that the European Parliament is almost becoming a co-legislator with the European Commission on the technical definitions of regulation, has meant that particularly business has shifted and follows the policy process more and more, and the numbers going to the European Parliament have increased over time. And as you can see, if you combine the MEP and the actual committee data, the second two bars, they're almost on par now in terms of political activity with the European Commission. Lobbyists, our host today, communication companies, like Whitehouse, they are important and they're rising again, particularly post-Brexit. They are very important as secondary actors for business. They are scouts, they are collecting wider information. They have a good sense of the mood that is occurring in Brussels, and particularly for overstretched smaller companies, maybe that only have one individual working in government affairs, they are a resource to potentially help lobby and take positions to the various EU institutions. The other figure that I just want to say quickly, and then I will move on to my other graphs, is the European federations. I think this is an interesting bar to look at, because in the early 90s, there was a feeling that the European trade associations had become lowest common denominator policymaking venues. They were slow to react. They were always looking for compromises across their various members, and they weren't necessarily feeding what the European Commission and Parliament wanted into the policy process. They weren't necessarily bringing the European collective voice. Now, as you can see over time, there's been a rebirth of the use of European associations. And this can be accounted for a number of reasons. One is the number has increased. The second is that they disaggregated, so they no longer try and accommodate all members. So you have incumbent associations and you have new entrant associations, perhaps in energy or in telecoms, for example. You're seeing a realization by companies that if they want to build up their credibility to have good direct action to the European Commission, as individual players, their European credentials need to be strengthened. So participating within the European associations is a positive thing. So changing the membership structure to allow firms to participate has helped them to be quicker and more agile, but also gives them more resources and more voice. And so the European federations have had a sort of rebirth in the last sort of 10 to 15 years, which I think is interesting. The only other thing I'll say here, I won't talk through all the national obviously are important. Governments are involved, and national civil services are involved through both the council and the trilogues, and through comitology and obviously technical committees where national civil servants are going up. So the one thing to say is, if you want to have an effective political strategy in Brussels, is that you have to have a multi-channel strategy. You have to use all of the political channels, both domestic and European, both collective and direct. And as companies, you have an advantage here because, or as trade associations, you can double hats. You can put your message out many, many times through different venues, through different organizational forms, whether that's through an ad hoc alliance as a direct player, or using your trade association. And so I think that's one of the important things to sort of take away, is that to be effective, you need to build your credibility, and to build your credibility, you want that voice flowing from many different directions into the political process. Okay, can we move to the next slides? I'll try and be a little bit quicker on these. The next thing is sort of the meso level of the book. So one of the things is we tend to think that Brussels is, as I say, this elite pluralism, but when we disaggregate different policy areas, and here we have all the different DGs, we start to see variation in terms of numbers. You can see that at the top, these are high areas of regulatory activity, but also high areas of mobilization of interest groups. When we look at environment, research, business and industry, single market, energy, all of those at the top. They're also areas that are highly technical. And because of that, you see a higher number as a percentage proportion of in-house lobbyists. That's the darker gray, the second bar in from the right. Sorry, we lost the colors when we created these slides. And what that's sort of showing is the Commission, particularly on technical issues, likes to have experts that are on the ground that are going to have to implement, they're going to have to deliver this policy. And so they are particularly open in consultations, and also by definition on the supply side, these are the actors that are the most affected by the pieces of regulation. When we move down to some of these lower area activity regulatory areas, these are more distributive policy areas. And I've said where we tend to look at policy areas that are perhaps slightly more distributive, the Commission particularly is very aware that it needs to be seen to be having a wider consultation. It wants to have more diverse types of groups. And there we see more mobilization of think tanks, of NGOs, which are the second two bars going towards the left. And so if you see them in total numbers, if you see them in percentages, the ratios start to get a little bit better in the distributive area for these other types of groups, whereas the ratio is dominated towards economic groups when we're talking about regulatory issues. Okay, I'll move to the next slide. So what I was saying there is there's a chameleon pluralism, really. There's variation across policy in terms of the mobilization types of groups. Now, if we look at the European Parliament, the numbers who are accredited are lower than the 12,000 or 13,000 that go to the Commission. We're talking here about sort of some 2,000 interest groups and 4,000 individuals. But what's interesting, if I was to put the pie graphs up for each of them, which are in the book, you'll see that the ratios of economic interests to NGOs is about the same. About 50% of the groups that are accredited are economic groups, about 23% are NGOs. And that's about the same ratio as going to the European Commission. And that, I remember when we first did this, was quite interesting, because I'd always said you would get a different constellation of interests that would mobilize around the European Parliament. What we did see when we did qualitative interviews of individuals is the voice is different, the message is different, the way it's said. So they'll be lobbying on the same directive, but the way and the arguments they maybe make are framed in a slightly different way. And obviously when we hear from my colleague on the panel, she'll be able to talk about how organizations frame their voice in trying to influence MEPs. But I do think it's interesting to say that the ratios are the same. What I would say is when you looking at companies, when we map them, they are the same companies that are active in the European Commission. When we look at NGOs, it's not necessarily the same types of NGOs, because you get more domestic NGOs and domestic civil society groups going into the Parliament than going to the Commission, whereas the Commission funds many of these pan-European NGO organizations, and those are obviously their natural interlocutors. But the other thing to take away that's very interesting, though, and this was again interesting for us, is when we looked at the policy areas for the committees, and this is the committees broken down, we saw a very similar phenomena that we saw in the European Commission, that where technical issues were active, things on the single market or on finance and so forth, we saw more economic groups mobilizing, and we saw less NGOs. And when it was distributed, you saw the same sort of range. And in the book, we map statistically, and we control for size, the same policy areas, and we put them together, and we make them ratios rather than total numbers. And you actually see that the mobilization rates of private actors or NGOs or civil society or think tanks are almost the same across the policy areas. And that's very, very interesting. Now, there is some variation here. This phenomena tends to happen when we see OLP, when we're seeing the sort of ordinary legislative process. When the Parliament has its own initiatives, we start to see more wider consultation, more think tanks, more civil society coming into the policy debates. But what's interesting is there was less variation about policy areas than we had expected, and there's more variation across the policy areas than there is across the policy institutes. Okay, I'll just move to the next slide. This is the professional breakdown. This is a revolving door story. I'll say this very quickly because I'm aware of time for the others. The European offices on average spend about $500,000 a year. They're on average 2 to 5 people in terms of government affairs expertise. There's about 350 that actually have offices physically in Brussels. There's about 750 that were identified that have EU capacity. And that they generally have one very senior individual that often reports to the board or certainly high up into the organization. And these individuals have changed. When I first studied, as I said, they came out of the Commission primarily. They were basically seen as those trying to drive the European project. And they were often seen as too distant from the companies. So during the 2000s and 2010s, as the liberalization directive, and the fact that the Commission and Parliament wanted technical expertise, the individuals have changed. And today we see about 70% of these individuals are actually in-house. They come through the organization or through the sector. They may move from one pharmaceutical company to another, or but they generally know the sector and they know the policy issues. And that's very interesting. That's counterintuitive to the argument of revolving doors that we see within the US. And it shows to a degree that this trust-based, this technocratic policymaking process that is Brussels. And the other interesting thing is many of them stay in their jobs a long time, just as the functionaries do within the European Commission. On average, they're there 8 to 9 years, which is a long time to be in a government affairs role in a particular office. I think I'll stop there. I'll say one thing is those sort of second and third people within the organization perhaps bring some of that political understanding. They're often people who've gone to the College of Europe, have been functionaries, have not functionaries, have been interns in the Parliament or have done interns in the Commission, and they understand the day-to-day intricacies of the policy area for which they've been hired, but they're often on shorter contracts. Okay, I'll move on. I'll skip this slide because I think I've said everything there for time. So we'll move to my conclusions, which is basically, I think Brussels has a distinct EU style of lobbying that's unique to Brussels. There's a new style of direct action, which is based on discretion, it's based on information and trust over the long time. It's about building reputations, it's about reinforcing your message, and there's been this professionalization of government affairs. And the other thing to take away is that there is more variation across policy than there is necessarily across institutions in terms of lobbying style, but certainly between the European Parliament and the European Commission, which I think is something perhaps we can explore with my two colleagues on the panel, and I'll stop there.
David, thank you so much for your insights and for summarizing nearly 3 decades of research for us. You talked about MEP attitudes to lobbying. So we have MEP Pilar del Castillo Vera on the call, and we'd like to get her views and her experience on bad and good practice of lobbying on the part of those organizations that you've mentioned earlier. Pilar, the floor is yours. Thank you. Pilar, you're on mute.
Okay, now it's okay. Now, sorry. Well, I was saying that I like to start saying thank to Whitehouse Communications for inviting me to the presentation of Professor Coen's book. I must say that the book provides a very complete analysis of how interest representation works in Brussels. So what I am going to do is basically comment on aspects of the book. I had a great coincidence based on my experience on practically everything that is said in this book. So what I am going to do is to focus on some points in which, well, I can add little things. Well, it's clear that Professor Coen's study is fruit of a very long study work using a huge variety of sources, including periodical service to a business sector, no more no less than almost 30 years of work. So, but all this has translated in a wide and really precise view of how business lobbying works in the EU. I must say that I welcome also the author's joint political science and business perspective in his analysis. On the other hand, the introduction of some comparative perspective, comparative approach with the US Congress brings some relevant information, although the truth is that the EU is one of its kind. So it's very difficult to compare. So, but in any case, there are some points which are interesting. I like the US, the European Union is composed of sovereign states, and consequently, the interaction with lobbies is determined by the complexity of regulating for 27 countries. In this context, in the context of the European Parliament, this difficulty increases even further. The 7 political parliamentary groups are at the same time constituted by over 27 national political parties. But all in all, we have about 140 political parties in the European Union. You can imagine how this makes much more complex all the process, how many nuances and soft nuances and soft nuances you can find all through the regulatory decision-making process. This complexity is not limited in any case to the procedural aspect of the institutional consensus buildings. It is also reflected in the content of the legislation. In order to advance further in the development of the single market, and knowing that member states will be the ones implementing the legislation, the EU legislation tries to limit the room for maneuver of its members, and is much more precise than a bill from the US Congress that leaves federal agencies with a greater margins of interpretation. As I note here, the situation also has important consequences, and Professor Coen, of course, mentioned that as well, in the technical knowledge and career developments of its civil servants, both compare the European institutions and the US Congress as well. Functionaries have long-standing careers. For this reason, I cannot agree more with the differences that Professor Coen signaled with the revolving doors phenomena that we see in the US, totally different. What is the career, what is the long-standing in one case compared to the other one, and so many other different things. But allow me now go more to the core of the book and mention some themes of the reflection and conclusion of Professor Coen's. First, the added value that lobbies provide to policymakers. So I'm talking about my own experience. So I'm talking, that one that received, this information and interact. There is no doubt, and I subscribe absolutely that the limited amount of civil servant, together with the complexity of the legislative proposals, entails the need to optimize every available resource. And from this perspective, lobbies can provide a knowledgeable insight on the impact of present and future legislation. This is essential. I would say that this is essential for in any political system, in any institution which is representative in any parliament at national level. But here there is absolutely no doubt for specific reasons adding to that in the cases of national political system. These added values is clearly the case for commission functionaries, that you focus more in some way that in European Parliament, but it equally applies to members of Parliament. This is true to the extent that beyond regular parliamentary committees and political group hearings, for example, the European Parliament in the ordinary structure supports the creation of what are called parliamentary intergroups. These are informal groups of members of Parliament that show a particular interest on a particular policy area, where companies and NGOs are invited to collaborate on regular basis. The intergroups are established at the beginning of every legislative term. We have now 27. Some of them are long-standing, such as the climate change, the biodiversity and sustainable development intergroup, but many other ones as well. In addition, there are, and this is a point that we have to take into account very much in terms of that interaction with the private and the sector, the business community. There are highly appreciated discussion fora, among others, European Internet Forum, the EIF, the European Energy Forum, EEF, or the Transatlantic Policy Network. I just mentioned some of them, but there are many more, where MEPs are able to undergo in-depth discussion with the private sector. To put this an example, the EIF created the European Internet Forum, created in 1999, is guided by over 70 MEPs from all political groups with a keen interest in Europe's digitalization, and it's composed by more than 100 companies and associations for this sector. So practically a huge spectrum of stakeholders are part of this forum. The EIF has a continuous program debate that includes long-standing participation of commissioners, senior officials of the European Commission, the European Council, etc. Of course, experts from all the sectors. Second point, the EU is not, in my view, exclusively a regulatory state, will depend on the issues. No doubt there is a great deal of technocracy, mainly due to the complexity of many of the issues where institutions regulate. However, there is also passionate debates about politics. You know, this is like in any other parliament at national level. Let's see, online rights, civil liberties, external relations, migration, are just some of the examples that all the time are present in each plenary meeting, of course in Strasbourg, but in the committees as well. And let me add that even for the more technical dossiers, we also have a political component. From this perspective, I would like to refer to case study number 3, the one dealing with net neutrality, but also with roaming. It's important not to forget the presence of roaming in this dossier to get whatever conclusion you get, but it's important not to forget that. And also it was the radio spectrum policy review, which is regulated, as you know, by the European institutions. Finally, the spectrum policy at this time couldn't go through because the Council was very determined not to go to debate this with Parliament if we wanted to go through. And of course, we have net neutrality, we have roaming, and we wanted to go through. As I said, I was the rapporteur for this in this dossier. On this file, I opened a public consultation in to the style of the Commission. I put a number of questions, you know, to many different stakeholders. I received 400 position papers from all types of stakeholders. I did that because there were so many controversial issues, and not only such as, but also there was quite a high degree of unsatisfaction with the Commission proposal. So I thought that I should have managed this with the big proportions that in all respect required, and instead of having one by one of these kind of things, then I decided to open this, and it works really, really well. It's something very unique. I never did it later on, but well, this was I was commenting brings me back to my key message that I mentioned. That is that enriching the principle of open internet was not simply technically. Politically, we had to define the general principle that internet providers will be required to treat all traffic equally, when providing internet access without discrimination, restriction, of interference, and irrespective of the sender or receiver, the context access or distributed or the application or services used. Together with this, in the text, we have the definition and clarified as well the requirements regarding the provision of a specialized service. That was a key point with a specific quality requirement. And of course, always you have some further guidelines that someone has to develop. Sometimes that will come as a delegated act from the Commission, but in this case, we introduce the need for BEREC, the body of European regulation in electronic communication. I was the rapporteur also in the creation of BEREC, and that was a proposal very much to do with this, because the proposal of the Commission was the creation of an agency, you know, in the classical way, big one with a lot of people, a lot of money, a lot of power. So at that time, I was very mature in any case for this kind of thing, and I am not very favorable of this kind of big agency in the case of the European Union, but that was not the moment in any case, and they would propose something, you know, that was an upgrade of what would have previously in terms of the interaction of different national regulators, but that's another story. And we ask in this case, in the net neutrality and roaming case, regarding net neutrality, a further guideline and a specification from BEREC, which is something very normal. But politics was also there, you know. Third, credibility and trust is key. I can't agree more. My observation throughout these years in Brussels is that the most efficient lobbies are those that have a reputation for ensuring quality work, which is absolutely a coincidence with the conclusion of Professor Coen. I must add that the importance of reputation is and trust is bi-directional, and also applies to members of parliaments. In other words, lobbies also identify and prioritize those interactions with MEPs that due to their work have shown more in-depth knowledge and high reputation, and based on that are more influential. It's very common sense. I mean, it's nothing so special, but it is like that. I mean, credibility and trust is absolutely key and goes in both directions, also with MEPs. Four, the importance of building sophisticated coalition. That's very interesting point, because it's something that is many times out of the, you know, the scenario is at the back side. Putting resources together and expanding the geographical coverage and including different sectors is certainly a very valuable instrument of efficient lobbies. This coalition can, of course, be of a more permanent nature. Associations is exactly that. No, I mean, it's a coalition between different companies from the same sector. So in these cases, they come together because they share a high degree of interest and are permanent. However, this coalition can also be circumstantial when they have the common proposal. They are permanent with different point of view, but in a specific point, they have a common proposal. And now, here is the point. Likewise, we also find some sectorial alliance that bring together, for example, energy companies and green NGOs, or big tech and civil society. In some cases, NGOs, as you said, Professor Coen, operate like gatekeepers, helping companies to legitimate their voice. As I think this is so obvious, you know, in some cases. And this is an interesting part of the story. We have not debated more on that, but some of those coalitions, I must say, have been quite influential on the decision-making process of the European Parliament, at the stage of the European Parliament, for sure. Well, to conclude, let me share your conclusion, Dr. Coen, and state that after Brexit, it is even more important for UK companies to reinforce their lobbying efforts. Some of the hardest lobbying come from member states' permanent representation, and the UK doesn't have this resource anymore. Let me finish as I started. Dr. Coen's book is by all respects outstanding. And I said that really, I mean, you have to believe me, I mean, it is based not only on I am a professor of political science, so I have costume, and it's very academic, the book. I mean, it is, you know, the methodology and all the requirements of an academic book is there, but it's not only that. It is not only an excellent academic work, but also an indispensable handbook for business lobbying in the EU. So congratulations, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Pilar, and thanks so much for sharing your experience. We know you have to leave 5 minutes before the end of the webinar, so we'll make sure to allow enough time for questions from the audience. Andy, your perspective as a business advisor.
Good morning, everyone. I'll keep my comments very short so that we do get a good chance to get some questions from the audience in. I'll first start by endorsing exactly what Pilar said about David's book. I mean, if you're part of the lobbying community in Brussels, this book is useful not just because it provides a kind of academic background for what we do, but because it actually has a very good and interesting discussion about how people go about doing the things that we do. And you'll see lots of echoes of the things that you've done in your policy areas described in others. And I think it will give a whole set of pointers about what is good practice and an efficient way of achieving things. So I really do recommend it. And it's well written. So it's not one of those academic texts which you know, you can read about 2 pages and you fall asleep. This one, given your background, you will actually find riveting. I mean, one could even describe this as a holiday read for lobbyists. So I really do recommend it. One point I was going to pick up, and I think that follows on very much from what Pilar said, is that although the arguments that we make are always based on as much information as we can supply, and they're couched in technical terms, politicians and policymakers are always faced by a choice of different sets of technical arguments, which point to very different policy outcomes and potentially very different institutions which will exercise discretion. So it may push decision-making down to NRAs or member states, or it may give them to agencies or the European Commission. And the different companies and other organizations that are lobbying for different sets of decision makers, different sets of potential outcomes, will argue it in technical terms, but fundamentally the choices are political. And while it is true that, you know, compared to what happens in the US, it's a much less, dare I say it, crude process. In the EU, the political element really does come in through the Parliament and through the Council. And of course, that has a secondary political effect on the European Commission, if European Commissioners want to have renewed mandates. But it's really at the Parliament and Council level that it comes in. And it's always very interesting to see the different perspective potentially that MEPs from a country take from their member state authority. And of course, that derives from the fact that if powers are attributed to the European level and to the European Commission or to an agency, that makes MEPs more relevant back in their member state. So the technical arguments that MEPs may find more convincing may be very different from the technical arguments which a national regulator or a ministry might find convincing. Well, I'll leave my comments there because that will give us some time for questions. So I'll hand back to you, Viviana.
Thanks so much, Andy. Let's get into the questions from the audience straight away. And I have one for Pilar before you have to take off. It's from Wilhelm Lehmann, visiting fellow at the European University Institute. Do you have the impression that lobbying approaches to the European Parliament have changed during the pandemic? And if so, to which extent? and in what direction?
Yes, well, I think everything has changed during the pandemic. So human interaction has changed, and that's there's the base for changing practically everything in terms of work, not only in the European Parliament or in other beyond politics. But I think clearly we have lost a lot. We have lost the interaction, direct interaction, informal interaction. In that sense, there was a lot of webinars. I mean, there's a lot of webinars, but this has some limits. It is, you can do something, you can debate something. We did it for a long, long time. European Parliament started to work remote for the very beginning of the pandemic. In March, we started with these online systems. Of course, the companies and the companies in the digital sector, tech sector, imagine much more in some way. But that was a solution. That was the only way to do it. That's safe, really. And I think in reality, the level of digitalization we have now and the level and the infrastructure we have in Europe safe to a great extent, not only the debate in Parliament or the discussion in Parliament, the way the Parliament works, but I would think really, infrastructure safe very much, and digital technologies, the European economy and economy in many other places. So this is not must be forgotten. But I think that has changed in the losing, let's say. I wouldn't say being less efficient, but indeed it is less efficient. I mean, nothing to do with having a debate in the parliamentary committee, the presidential one, nothing to do with having an intergroup meeting, nothing to do with having EAF, EEF, TPN, or many other debates with stakeholders, which was the common currency in this parliament, and one of the singularities that we appreciate so much. So I think it has changed, but has survived at the same time, because we have, these technical possibilities. I hope that sometimes, I think we are dreaming. After the dream, it comes some period of, let's say that water down these possibilities to go through, but I think obviously has been affected as it was in many other cases, different interaction in any sector, public or private.
Thank you. Andy?
Yeah, what I've heard from some NGOs, particularly vis-a-vis having meetings with the Commission on dossiers, is that they felt this period has actually led to a democratization because they couldn't previously afford to send people to the multiplicity of meetings that happen, and actually having to go on the internet has kind of leveled the playing field. So they found themselves in the same position as businesses and been able to attend far more meetings and make more input. So I guess once things normalize, there may still be quite a demand for making a lot of meetings online.
Yeah, if I may, I think that these are some experiences that we have to take into account, as you said. But I think so. I think we have to take from the experience. Has opened the door with new possibility for those that are having more difficulties on that. That is true, and that must be incorporated. But as a, let's say, a normal way of dealing with this requires very much. Can you not imagine to what extent? I'm sure you know the informal contact, not with a business member or the business community or the association or the NGOs, but among the MEPs, we need this informal contact. Sometimes negotiations take place inside the European Parliament, among different political groups, among different MEPs, thanks to this possibility to have informal, let's say, contacts in many aspects. So if you withdraw the equation this, at the end, you have a poorer, let's say, environment to really deserve the best quality job. But I agree with you, we have to incorporate all the new experiences as far as they represent an advantage for people that, not an advantage, a possibility for people that before was out of the scene. Thank you.
Thanks. And some of the interactions indeed feel a little bit more transactional than they were previously, where you could have informal chats, right? We have another question from Rafiq Amar, assistant to MEP Karima Delli, is asking, are there different national styles of lobbying in Brussels? And David, perhaps I'll give the floor to you to respond to this.
Yes, I mean, well, yes and no. I mean, one of the things I was trying to make the argument for, and I think we all agree, is that Brussels has a distinct style of lobbying that is unique to Brussels. It's an N of one, and it's an interesting N of one, which is based on, you know, building your reputation, building your credibility, building consensus, building alliances to facilitate access, providing that technical information. So over time, companies and organizations that want to lobby have had to learn to lobby in the Brussels way, or they are slightly disadvantaged. It was but at the same time, every country has cultural styles, and these permeate how they make representation to their MEPs, how they utilize their trade associations and their European associations. If you're coming from a corporatist tradition like Germany, you know, the German companies have always been and are very active in utilizing their national associations that feed into their European associations, that feed into the policy debate. More Anglo-Saxon corporations were quite good in the early days of building these advocacy coalitions that we heard about, you know, working with traditional groups that you would see as countervailing, working with NGOs, working with other companies that perhaps would have been their rivals, and building complicated coalitions around making high energy users be low energy users. So there are cultural differences which maybe affect on the margins, but I think there is still a distinct style of lobbying within Brussels. I mean, if you think about Spain, many Spanish companies, because of the strong regional authorities and the regional offices, that, you know, some of these companies will come through and utilize the regional offices, whereas regional offices in the UK are relatively, or were relatively weak. So you'll get nuances there. But I'll defer also to the panel and to those that have had the experience of being lobbied. You probably have seen different cultural experiences.
Yeah, if I may, I stay because I mean, I will arrive 5 minutes later, but I prefer to stay here for a little while. Yeah, I think I agree. I think at the end of the day, beyond the cultural background and personalities of the people that they work in the lobby sector, I think you adapt to the features of a particular institution, political institution. In the case of Europe, being Commission of Parliament or the permanent representations. But if you are in Washington, you have to, you know, apply something which are, you know, Washington expression and way to do things, the Washington way. If you are in New Delhi, you have to accept the New Delhi style. And if you are in Peking, you can imagine what you have to do. I mean, this is very much determined previously for the context where the institution it is, and their own procedures, rule, and all these things. So the European Union, you have to adapt. It's not more French. I mean, when I have meetings with whatever, the French permanent representation, a commissioner from France, or the company, I mean the companies, different, also companies of any kind. Of course, there is, I mean, you speak, you know, French with a French accent, with a Spanish accent, so everything, you know, all nuances, all of these kind of things intervene. But at the end of the day, we are talking about you are doing lobbying in the EU, you're lobbying in Washington, you're lobbying in there. So not important thing, only in the margins, as you correctly said.
Thank you.
That's interesting you mentioned the French companies, because the French companies historically were quite late to come to Brussels with their government affairs offices because they believed in the status model. The French government would fight the corner through the council. And then in the early 90s, with the single market directives, they were disadvantaged on various issues, and they learned very quickly that they had to be good Europeans with active in their trade associations and active in Brussels if they wanted to have a voice. So there's an interesting phenomenon there that they were pulled into lobbying in a European style.
Yeah, it's very interesting because for many years the more presence in terms of national interest, national government, as well as a vehicle of national interest, were Germany and UK. Absolutely. Germany and UK. The other were disappeared. I mean, for a long, long time, you don't feel never, directly some kind, a wave of interest expression from national governments of other members. That's very interesting because, well, now it's different. You have from Poland to many others, which is totally different now, the landscape. But that was amazing that only countries that had this presence were Germany and UK. That's very clear.
The one thing that I think makes the lobbying culture very different in Brussels from some of the other capitals that I've lobbied in is that many of the politicians and policymakers are people that have taken those jobs because they believe in the European project and the European ideal. And that makes the issue of federalism or not federalism an important subtext in every single dossier about where powers are going to be attributed and where they should move over time. And I think it's very difficult for lobbyists coming into Brussels that are not here all the time and are not part of that debate to realize just how important that is at the back of any discussion.
Thank you so much, Andy, and thanks everyone. Unfortunately, we have to wrap up. Our time has come to an end, but I just wanted to thank you, the panelists, for attending and for your great interventions, and also all of our attendees. As I mentioned, we'll try to respond to the other questions that have come in the next few days, and we'll also send a recording of the webinar around. If you want to get in touch, our details are on the slide. Thanks so much, everyone. And have a lovely rest of the week.
Thank you very much. It was real pleasure.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.
We keep in touch.
Absolutely.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you.